It sounds ridiculous now for me to say I didn't realize how hard teachers were working before I worked in a school building, but it's completely true. Hi y'all, Dr. Martha here. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and I have been working with children and families for the last 20-something years, and I have been working in schools for the last 14. I have a deep respect for educators, for what they do in the classroom, for the powerful impact they have on children's lives. But I have to be honest, that wasn't always true. Before I started doing trauma-informed schools work, I had worked with teachers collaterally. I had been in private practice for some years before that, and I had spoken to teachers individually, sometimes on the phone. I had attended IEPs. I had gone to other kinds of teacher-parent conferences and meetings to support parents and students who were clients of mine. And I really saw that as me doing a lot, that I just showed up to some of those meetings, that I sometimes made that phone call to the teacher. But often when I called teachers, they didn't respond because maybe they were teaching. And in some ways that started to feel like a waste of effort. And then I got embedded into an elementary school here in San Francisco, and I was astonished. It sounds ridiculous now for me to say I didn't realize how hard teachers were working before I worked in a school building, but it's completely true. When I talk about cultural humility, when I'm talking about trauma-informed schools work, I'm often talking about racism, sexism, ableism, these isms and the way that they keep us from connecting with other people. But today I'm just going to bend it a little bit and talk about cultural humility in terms of understanding where someone else is coming from and what someone else is doing in the moment more broadly. Once I started working in a school building, I realized not only how hard the work itself is, but what kind of an environment that is. School buildings are not easy buildings to be in. When I first started, I did 3 days a week at the school and 2 days a week at the hospital where my program was housed. And I can remember, I think I did Monday, Tuesday at school, Wednesday, Thursday at the hospital, Friday back at school. And I can remember Tuesday afternoons being like, whew, tomorrow I just go to the hospital where I'm going to sit at a desk and write notes and go into meetings and talk about cases with other clinicians. Schools are often places that are hectic, noisy, and chaotic. Just being in those buildings can be hard on our nervous systems. Now, obviously, I believe that many teachers have learned different ways to cope with that and might not still experience it that way. But I think if you talk to a first-year teacher, that teacher will likely say, wow, there's a lot going on all the time here. Multiple times a week, I would ask for the key to the storage room. It was a long, narrow room that had like crayons and colored paper. I don't think people went in there much, but I would just go in there to be still, to be mostly quiet. I mean, I could still hear stuff outside that door, but I would just go in there and take some deep breaths some days. I avoided the cafeteria like it was on fire. It's so noisy in so many school cafeterias. Not that I'm saying that I think children should have silent lunches. I want children to be able to have an opportunity to connect with their peers. I wonder about school cafeterias and the design of that they're always in such big rooms where the sound is so echoey. There must be schools out in the world where they have dampened that sound some. If you're at one of those schools, send me a message. I would love to hear about how y'all did that. And all of that noise and chaos and activity, all of that is just a regular day. That doesn't include days when folks like the kids that I were seeing or other children or other adults were really having a hard time, and so were raising their voices or yelling or throwing things or tearing stuff off the walls. Just on a regular day, it was noisy and chaotic. So first there's the atmosphere that teachers are living in, and then there are the requirements that school districts put on teachers. There are requirements about curriculum, but there's also requirements about implementing new things all the time. Just since I started working in schools, I have heard of at least 3 new maths. So starting up new ways of doing things, and then administrators also have ideas about what they want. So maybe there are social emotional programs, maybe there are programs, mindfulness programs, maybe there are PBIS programs, ways that we're hoping to help students be their best selves. And those demands don't always match up. I was in a school once where the requirement was that the teachers did a certain amount of mindfulness every day, but also the teacher I was working with told me that when she was having her students do mindfulness, the principal came in and said, "Why aren't your students doing, ELA right now?" Sometimes the things that teachers are being asked to teach, they haven't had much training on themselves. It's a tough gig. And so many of the teachers I see are doing such a great job, even in the face of all of those things. Teachers have often said to me, "I'm not a therapist." And they're right, they're not therapists. And our training as clinicians and their training as educators are often really, really different. And yet, I still think there's a huge benefit to having a clinician in the building, to having a clinician that we can talk to about students, about the school, about discord among staff, about our own well-being practices. As clinicians, we're often trained that we're going to be sitting in a quiet office with one person. Now, I was trained as a marriage and family therapist, so I expected to have a whole row of people sitting on the couch in my office. But in general, we're in a quiet office, one-to-one, and we're going to talk about feelings, and we're going to think about strategies, and we're going to practice skills. So before I started working in schools, I would sometimes ask a teacher to help cue my client, their student, to do a practice that would be helpful to that student. Maybe that would be some breathing, maybe it would be to write in their journal, maybe it would be to slow things down a little bit. When I think about those now, I'm like, wow, I don't know that any teacher could have done what I was actually asking them to do. Which is why a trauma-informed clinician could be so helpful. Once I started working in a school building, I never once said to a teacher, "You should do this thing with my client because it will help him or her." So many of the things that I would want for my client as a clinician would help everyone in the classroom, including the teacher. Slowing things down, taking a deep breath, having a brain break. All of those things are good for all of our brains and nervous systems. Now, some things may amp students up in a way that teachers do not get amped up about, like maybe learning a new math thing doesn't feel stressful for the teacher who really understands it well. But if learning a new math thing comes from a teacher who's also stressed out because they just learned about it last week, that's going to be tough on everyone. So slowing things down might be good for everyone in the classroom. Also, as a clinician in the building, I can see some of what's going on and might be contributing to what's going on for my client. Certainly the first time I walked into a school cafeteria as an adult, where my client was sitting with their hands over their ears, I was like, oh, it's just too loud in here for that client. It's just too loud. What are some things we could do instead of this? Not that I want to segregate that student necessarily, but maybe there's a quieter corner they could sit in. Maybe they could wear noise-canceling headphones. Where as an outside therapist, I might have been like, why is this kid always having a thing after lunch? What's going on at lunch? And maybe nothing big is going on. Maybe it's just the noise level gets too high. And if we think about how trauma shows up after the fact, so if something bad happened in your house or your neighborhood that was really loud, loudness might just make you start to feel worried, even though you may not know that you're making that connection, the loud thing over here and the loud thing over there. As a clinician working in a school building, I have also had the opportunity to just sit with adults, to help adults process in the moment something that just happened. Sometimes my presence in a meeting reminds people that they want to be thinking about trauma, that they want to be considering ways to be more collaborative, that they want to think about who this child is connected to, that they want to think about what kind of relationship they are building, what kind of relationships they are demonstrating to the student. Often I've been in school meetings where people are talking about a student in a particular kind of way where they are hypothesizing about why the student is doing the thing that the student is doing. And I have been able to roll tape on the student's experience. I have been able to express what might be going on from the student's perspective, right? So the teachers have their perspective, the educators have their perspective, and the student has their perspective. And often in these kinds of meetings where we're talking about students and student behavior and student success, the students themselves aren't present. And it's helpful to have an adult who can say, this is what I think might be going on from the other perspective. Now, I'm not talking about breaching HIPAA or telling someone else's life story, but there is something to be said for having someone who can talk from the kiddo's perspective. I have heard from clinicians that they think that the teacher is the problem. And after all the time I've spent in school buildings, maybe that's sometimes true. But I've also heard from teachers that the clinical stuff is not important, that the time the kiddo spends in my office is like free time and therefore not worthwhile. I'm here talking about cultural humility today because I believe that both sides could stand to imagine the thing from the other's perspectives. Now, I'm not saying teachers need to become therapists, but I do think it might help for them to be able to see the work of therapy as also hard work, as also worthwhile. The same way I think the therapists need to see what teachers are up against and give them credit for doing the things that they do. I have been doing this work for nearly 15 years, and I really believe that a clinician in the building can be a great thing. If you're interested in doing clinical work in school buildings, or if you're already doing clinical work in school buildings and want to learn more, we're going to start a cohort in the coming school year where we meet with clinicians. We talk about the work that's happening in schools now, ways to make that work more trauma-informed, clinical consultation, and systems change work. You can follow me here or sign up for our newsletter so you know when those applications open. Take care, y'all.